All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon. In this video, we're going to talk about Terence Crawford pointing out a double standard as it relates to Canelo Alvarez, or an unfair comparison as it applies to Canelo Alvarez and really who should be considered the best fighter in boxing. Let's talk about that in this video. Welcome back to the channel. This is a conversation for hardcore boxing fans. This is not a conversation for casual fans or for people that are just really locked up in box office, hoopla, right? Box office hoopla and, selling tickets and having big crowds and all that stuff are very, very important. However, it is not everything in boxing. And when we talk about who the best fighters are, sometimes, the mixture of those things, the skill set and the big ticket sales can kind of create some false comparisons in boxing. And that is what Terence Crawford said in an interview that he had ahead of his fight with Sean Porter, which a fight that I think, and most boxing fans, if you guys really pay attention to the sport, know is one of the best fights of the year. It's a difficult fight for Terence Crawford. A guy, he's fighting a guy in Sean Porter that gives everybody a tough fight. Terence Crawford is favored to win the fight because, in the words of guys like Danny Garcia and other people that have made predictions for the fight, he just has a skill set, has more tools in his toolbox than Sean Porter does. Is probably maybe a little bit fresher fighter than Sean Porter is, even though they're right around the same age. He has an experience gap, as it relates to Sean Porter, because Sean Porter's been in with so many top fighters and Terence Crawford is not, but it is a legitimate tough fight that Terence Crawford is favored to win. So in the conversation, the interviews ahead of it, he was asked about, does he think, that he's the best fighter in the world? And, what does he have to say about the people that point to the fact that he has not had the big name fights that other fighters have had? And they specifically ask about Canelo Alvarez and, and the fact that Canelo Alvarez has, they point to the fact that Canelo Alvarez, like a lot of people have been lately, point out the fact that Canelo Alvarez has fought 4 times in the last 12 months. And in that short amount of time has become an undisputed champion at 168 pounds, right? Now, if you read comment, and this is why I'm saying this is not a conversation for just, people that are just believe anything that they read. I don't want to say believe anything they read, but are just caught up in a lot of hoopla and don't, actually look at the people that they're fighting and look at the scenario between the two fighters, right? So people laying on, so Terence Crawford is saying that the difference between him and Canelo, which I do believe is reasonable, is that Canelo Alvarez is able to pick his fights while Terence Crawford is not able to pick his fights. And that is absolutely true. With Canelo Alvarez, Canelo Alvarez is probably the only fighter in boxing other than an inactive, and I'm going to say this, continue to say this, an inactive Floyd Mayweather Jr. Floyd Mayweather Jr. is a retired fighter. Yes, Floyd Mayweather Jr. could come out and fight whoever he wants, and if he fought a big name fighter like an Errol Spence, yes, he would probably do well over 1 million pay-per-views for fights like that. I understand that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is a bigger star than Canelo. However, Canelo Alvarez is an actual fighter fighting actual fights, and Floyd Mayweather Jr. is fighting YouTubers. So sorry, before anybody leaves that in the comment section, I have to put that out there when I say that Canelo Alvarez is the biggest name in boxing. He is the only guy that in that short amount of time could have pulled that off. How you have to be able to get these fights and pay these guys career high paydays that they won't turn down to get these guys to fight you back to back to back, right? Take, for example, Caleb Plant. Caleb Plant is not going to go and fight somebody other than Canelo Alvarez when Canelo Alvarez is paying him $10 million to fight him. Same thing for Billy Joe Saunders. Billy Joe Saunders is not going to go fight Callum Smith, he's not going to go fight Caleb Plant for the IBF belt And when you have an opportunity to fight Canelo, right? When Billy Joe Saunders had the WBO, the only person that's going to get that fight is Canelo Alvarez. Billy Joe Saunders, likewise, is not going to get the Callum Smith fight, even if he wanted to, if Canelo Alvarez says, I want to fight you. So while Canelo Alvarez is most certainly an excellent fighter, very, very skilled fighter, it's not enough when you're considering who the best fighter is based on things that happen in the ring. It's hard to compare him to other fighters that do not get the opportunities to make those fights. That said, okay, Terence Crawford does have the ability to catch Canelo Alvarez, and if he does things that are within his grasp. One of the things that always kind of blows me away about Terence Crawford is that Terence Crawford is he's very lackadaisical about fighting those top fighters. Now, maybe he's saying, when he gets on camera and he's talking about it in front of ESPN, in ESPN, an interview, he's been saying things like, these guys, I've been trying to get these guys haven't wanted to fight me, they haven't got in the ring with me. But when you listen to what he actually says, right? Like and I'm talking about, if you listen to every interview Terence Crawford does, like I've listened for several years, very few interviews that he has given that I have not at least heard excerpts from or heard the majority part of, because people do videos about him and people talk about him. He did not want to fight. Even right now, he's saying that, he's past the Errol Spence Jr. fight, right? Right before, he said he did not want to fight Sean Porter, right? He said he wanted to fight Keith Thurman, but at the time that he wanted to fight Keith Thurman, Keith Thurman didn't have a belt. He says he wants to fight Keith Thurman now, but Keith Thurman doesn't have a belt. So, while I understand what Terence Crawford is saying about the fact that Canelo Alvarez has the ability to pick fights and Terence Crawford doesn't have the ability to do that, it still seems to me that, Terence Crawford has done things throughout his career that have been more about, taking the safe route than taking the risks where he could have taken the risks. Now, specifically what I'm talking about is the fact that several years ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, he re-signed with Top Rank. He did not have to re-sign with Top Rank when he had the opportunity to re-sign with them. He could have went and become a free agent and tried to fight these guys over at the PBC and got himself in a position where he could have made those fights, right? That's what Canelo Alvarez did. Canelo Alvarez got out of his contract with Golden Boy, and that more than likely allowed him to get undisputed at 168, where he wasn't able to do that at 160. Like, a lot of people will say that Canelo Alvarez just really ducked, Jamal Charlo, and he ducked Demetrius Andrade. And I will call that a duck because the fights didn't happen, and there was reasons for those fights to happen. He was a champion in the division. Jamal Charlo was the WBC mandatory, right? Demetrius Andrade was the WBO champ. Also, Sergey Deverenchenko was his mandatory for the IBF, and he didn't fight Sergey Deverenchenko for that. But there is an argument to be said that wasn't Canelo Alvarez alone. That was Canelo Alvarez working in cooperation with DAZN and working in cooperation with Golden Boy. But now that he's a free agent, he did go over to the PBC, fought on that network to fight Callum Smith, right? To fight Caleb Plant. And that's something he did. I don't know how much of a risk it is when you're paying $40 million for it, and it's a guy that's a lot lower level fighter than you, but he jumped off that network and he did it. Floyd Mayweather Jr. jumped off Top Rank and into his own Mayweather Promotions in order to do that. And there really wasn't that big a difference when Floyd Mayweather Jr. did it in his career than where Terence Crawford was when he re-signed with Top Rank. So, I do think Terence Crawford it makes a point, like, in that when you're looking at how good a fighter is in the ring, I don't think you should necessarily, I don't think belts tell the whole story. I don't think how many tickets you sell. I definitely don't think how many tickets you sell tell the story. Perfect example of that is Anthony Joshua. I do think you need to look at how good the fighter is, how good the people in his division are. But even with that argument in place, it's still a hard argument for Terence Crawford to make. So anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.